The wind had teeth, and it was chewing on her bones. Lainey did not know how long she had been walking. 3 days, maybe 4. Time had dissolved into a single, agonizing ache that began in her feet and ended in her soul. The trail was gone, buried under 2 feet of Wyoming powder. She was following a creek bed, or what she thought was a creek bed, trusting the slight dip in the land. The trees had thinned out, offering no protection. The wind came across the open flats with a sound like a screaming woman. It stole the air from her lungs and plastered the thin calico of her dress against her skin. She had no coat. He had kept the coat. Jed, her stepfather, had thrown her out of the shack with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's worn-out button boots. The boots had split open yesterday. Snow packed itself against her stocking toes, and she had stopped feeling them hours ago. It was a blessing, she supposed. The numbness. "Useless," Jed had snarled, his face blotchy with whiskey and grief. "Another mouth. Get out!" Her mother had been dead 2 weeks. 2 weeks since the coughing had stopped and the terrible, final silence had settled in the one-room shack. Lainey had been the one to wash the body, to close her mother's eyes, and now she was being sent to join her. Lainey stumbled, catching herself on a wind-blasted sagebrush. The sticks were brittle and sharp, scratching her frozen hands. She looked down, blood, dark and sluggish, welled up on her knuckles and froze almost instantly. She felt no pain. She was so very tired. The cold was making her sleepy. She knew what that meant. Her mother had told her stories of trappers who lay down in the snow and never got up. It sounded peaceful. It sounded like rest. She saw a tree ahead, a tall ponderosa pine, its lower branches heavy with snow, forming a small cavern against the trunk. It looked like a shelter, a place to stop, just for a minute. She pushed through a drift that came up to her waist. The effort took the last of her strength. She leaned against the rough bark, sliding down until she was sitting on the snow. The wind was quieter here, muffled by the branches. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself small, to hold on to the last fading spark of body heat. She thought of her mother's smile. She thought of a warm bowl of stew. Long ago, she thought of nothing. The world went gray at the edges, then soft, and then black. Nathaniel Holt guided the team with a steady hand, his eyes scanning the landscape more out of habit than concern. Bess and Amos were good horses. They knew the way home, even in this. But the storm was worsening. The sky was a low, bruised purple, promising a blizzard that would last through the night and likely the next 3 days. He had supplies from town, sacks of flour and salt, oats for the stock, and 2 bottles of whiskey, enough to see him through. He lived alone. He preferred it. The ranch was secluded, tucked into a valley the railroad surveyors had missed, cradled by high pine ridges. It had been his wife's favorite place. He had not had a visitor in 6 months. He saw the lump near the creek bed, a shadow against the white. His first thought was a stray calf, caught in the open. He cursed under his breath, pulling the horses to a halt. The wagon runners creaked in the sudden silence. "Whoa, Bess." He wrapped his scarf tighter around his face and stepped down from the wagon. His boots, thick and greased, sank deep. The cold was sharp, biting through his heavy sheepskin coat. He walked toward the pine tree, his shoulders hunched against the wind. It was not a calf. He saw the color first, a patch of faded blue calico, almost invisible. Then hair, long and dark, fanned out across the snowdrift, threaded with ice crystals. He moved faster, his heart giving a single hard kick against his ribs. He knelt. It was a girl. She was curled tight, like a field mouse, her face buried in her knees. He put his gloved hand on her shoulder. She was still. He pushed the matted, frozen hair away from her face. She was young, maybe 19, maybe 20. Her skin was a pale, waxy white. Her lips were blue. He pressed his ear to her mouth, pulling his scarf down. He waited. Nothing. He held his own breath. And then, A tiny, shallow puff of air, no stronger than a moth's wing, brushed his skin. He did not hesitate. He was not a man given to second thoughts. He unbuttoned his coat, the big sheepskin that had cost him $20 and kept him alive through 5 Wyoming winters. The wind hit his chest, instantly numbing, but he ignored it. He gathered the girl into his arms. She weighed nothing, a bundle of sticks wrapped in ice. He wrapped his coat around her, pulling the thick wool collar up over her head. He lifted her. She gave a faint, sighing moan that was barely human. He carried her back to the wagon, his boots punching deep, angry holes in the snow. He laid her in the wagon bed, among the sacks of oats, and covered her with a heavy canvas tarp he used for the woodpile. He climbed back onto the driver's seat. He looked back at her once, just a still mound under the canvas. He clucked to the horses, snapping the reins. "You're safe now," he whispered. The words were for him, or maybe for the ghost of his wife. They were whipped away by the wind as soon as they were spoken. The wagon lurched forward, racing the coming night. The cabin was warm, but it was a man's warmth. It smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, coffee, and solitude. Nathaniel carried her inside and kicked the door shut against the howling storm. He laid her on the bearskin rug in front of the hearth. The fireplace was huge, built of river stone, and the embers from his morning fire were still glowing. He threw on kindling, then 2 heavy logs. The flames caught quickly, roaring up the chimney. He did not put her on his bed. The bed was in the corner, a private space piled with wool blankets. The hearth was neutral ground. He lit the lantern, and the small, one-room cabin filled with yellow light. He looked down at her. His coat was swallowing her. He knelt and gently unwrapped her. The dress was frozen solid. Her thin shoes were caked with ice. He went to the stove and filled the big kettle with snow from the bucket by the door. As it began to heat, he went back to her. He would have to cut the clothes off. He took his hunting knife from its sheath. He was careful, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He sliced the laces of the boots, which were frozen stiff. He pulled them off. Her feet were white, hard as wood. Frostbite, bad. He cut the dress up the back, the blade whispering through the frozen calico. He had to peel it away from her skin. He saw the bones of her ribs, stark under the pale flesh. He saw bruises, old and new, a yellowing stain on her ribs, a dark purple mark high on her arm. He set his jaw, his face grim. He worked with a deliberate, impersonal efficiency, as if he were skinning a deer. He wrapped her in the driest, cleanest wool blankets he owned and propped her head on a spare pillow. He spent the next hour tending her. He brought the basin of lukewarm water, never hot for frostbite, and bathed her feet and hands. He rubbed them, trying to bring the life back, but not too hard. He watched her face, but she did not stir. The fever set in around midnight. The shivering started, a violent, rattling quake that shook the blankets. She was no longer cold. She was burning. He sat with her, wiping her face with a damp rag, forcing spoonfuls of lukewarm water mixed with a little whiskey between her cracked lips. She was fighting. He could see that, but he did not know if it was enough. Lainey woke to pain. It was not the biting numbness of the cold, but 1,000 hot needles prickling her feet and hands. She woke to warmth, a heavy, smoky heat that pressed against her face. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was not the cracked plaster of Jed's shack. It was made of logs, dark with smoke. She was lying on something soft, a fur. She was wrapped in wool, heavy and smelling slightly of wet sheep. A fire roared in a stone fireplace beside her. She tried to sit up. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the room tilted. She fell back, groaning. A sound across the room, a chair scraping on a wood floor. She turned her head. A man was sitting at a rough-hewn table, a lantern hanging from a beam above him. He was large, broad-shouldered, with a dark beard that covered the lower half of his face. He was cleaning a rifle, the metal parts laid out on an oilcloth. He stopped his work. He was watching her. Laney's heart seized. The fear was instant, cold, and absolute. It was worse than the snow. She knew this script. She knew what men wanted when they found a girl alone. She clutched the blanket to her chin, her knuckles white. She was trapped. She had traded a cold death for a hot, violent one. "Where am I?" Her voice was a dry croak. The man finished wiping the barrel of the rifle. He did not set it down. His eyes were gray, the color of a winter sky. "My cabin." His voice was deep, and it rumbled in the small room. He looked at her, then at the fire, then back at her. She was ashamed. Ashamed of her filth, her poverty, her weakness. Ashamed of what he must be thinking. She braced herself, waiting for the demand, for the price of her rescue. He had saved her. Now he would collect. "What do you want?" she whispered, and she hated the tremble in her words. Nathaniel looked at the girl. She was terrified, coiled like a cornered rabbit. He saw the expectation in her eyes, and it turned his stomach. He had seen that look once before, on a whore in Cheyenne, and it had made him leave the saloon without buying his drink. He placed the rifle barrel back on the cloth. He stood slowly so as not to spook her. He walked to the stove, his back to her. "I want you to rest," he said, his voice calm. He picked up the kettle. "The storm's closed in. You're not going anywhere." He dipped a tin cup into the water bucket. He brought it to her, holding it out. He did not step onto the rug. He kept his distance. Laney stared at the cup, then at his face. He was not smiling. He was not leering. His expression was flat, unreadable. She reached a shaky hand out from the blanket and took the cup. Her fingers brushed his. His skin was rough, warm. She flinched, pulling her hand back as if burned. She drank. The water was cold and clean. He nodded once, then went back to his table. He sat down and picked up the rifle stock. Laney watched him. He did not speak again. The blizzard descended. For 4 days, the world vanished outside the single, ice-caked window. The wind did not howl, it screamed. It was a solid, living thing, a white demon trying to tear the cabin apart. The snow piled up against the door, reaching halfway to the roof. They were stranded. Laney remained on the hearth. It was her island. She felt safer by the fire, with her back to the stone. He had given her a canvas-covered bedroll and 2 more blankets. At night, he did not approach her. He laid out his own bedroll near the door, a full 10 feet away, and climbed into it with his boots still on. In the dark, the nightmares came for her. She was walking in the snow again, but this time Jed was behind her, laughing. She was in the shack, and her mother was coughing, her lungs rattling. Laney whimpered in her sleep, curling into a tight ball, her hands covering her head. She whispered "Mama" and "Stop" into the wool blanket. She always woke with a jolt, her heart pounding, expecting to find a hand on her. But there was only the sound of the fire and the man's steady breathing from across the room. Nathaniel respected her silence. He spoke little, and only when necessary. "The stew is ready. More wood for the fire." He moved with a quiet, powerful grace, tending the cabin as if she were not there. He fed the fire, shoveled snow from the doorway just to keep it from collapsing the timber, and checked on his 2 horses in the small, connected lean-to that served as a barn. He brought her food. It was simple food. Stew made from dried jerky and potatoes. Hot cornmeal mush in the morning. He would set the bowl on the edge of the hearthstone and walk away. He never watched her eat. He tended her feet. Twice a day, he would bring the basin and a jar of greasy, strong-smelling salve. He would gesture to her feet. "Let me see." The first time, she had refused, pulling the blankets tighter. "Miss," he said, his voice patient but firm. "The frostbite will take your toes if we don't tend it. Let me see." She had slowly, agonizingly, unwrapped her feet. The skin was blistering now, purple and red. She was ashamed of their ugliness. He knelt, his large frame blocking the firelight. He applied the salve with a measured, clinical touch. His hands were rough, but his grip was gentle. He did not linger. He did not let his hands stray. He was a man doctoring a sick animal. This impersonal care was the greatest kindness she had ever known. He never touched her unless it was necessary. On the third night, the fever broke, the shivering stopped, and she woke up drenched in sweat. But the breaking of the fever broke something else inside her. The cabin was dark, save for the low, orange glow of the embers. The man was asleep. She could hear his deep, even breaths. The storm had quieted to a low, mournful sigh. She was safe. The word felt foreign in her mind. She was warm. She was fed, and no one had hurt her. She turned her face into the musty pillow. The tears came. They were not the wild, screaming sobs of her grief for her mother. They were the silent, hot, hopeless tears of a lifetime of pain. She cried for her mother's wasted body. She cried for the cold hands of her stepfather, the day he'd grabbed her arm and told her she was of no more use. She cried for the men he'd tried to make her entertain, their whiskey breath and wet mouths. She cried because this stranger's kindness felt like a trick. It felt like a debt she was racking up, a bill that would come due the moment the storm cleared. Kindness was just a way to soften a body up before the real pain began. She cried until the blanket was soaked and her eyes were raw. The storm broke on the fifth morning. The wind was gone. The silence that fell was shocking, absolute. The world outside the window was a blinding, pristine white. Nathaniel pulled on his heavy coat, the spare one, an old canvas mackinaw, and his hat. He picked up his snow shovel. He had to dig his way to the barn, to check the roof and feed the horses properly. Lainey was sitting up. She had braided her hair, trying to bring some order to the tangled mess. She watched him, her eyes wide and haunted in the pale morning light. He put his hand on the door latch. "Mister." Her voice was thin, like dry grass. He stopped and turned, waiting. She had to know. She had to understand the terms. She could not bear the waiting. The debt. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. He frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together. "Why what?" "Why did you help me?" She gathered her courage, her gaze meeting his. "I was dying. Why'd you bring me here? Why didn't you just leave me?" Nathaniel Holt looked at her. He saw the raw terror in her eyes, the way she was braced, as if expecting a blow or an answer so cruel it would break her. He was not a man for speeches. He did not know how to explain the sudden, sharp emptiness of his cabin, or the way the sight of her, so small and broken in the snow, had pulled at something in his chest he thought long dead. He did not know how to tell her that he had failed to save his wife from the fever, and failed to save his infant son, and that he could not bear to fail again. He could not say any of that. He just shrugged, a small, stiff movement of his shoulders beneath the heavy coat. "Didn't seem right to leave you." He turned the latch. He pushed the door hard against the deep drift, the wood groaning. A shaft of brilliant, cold light cut across the room. He stepped out into the white, and the sound of his shovel biting into the crusted snow began. Lainey sat by the dying fire, the blanket pooled around her waist. She stared at the empty doorway. "Didn't seem right to leave you." It was not a bargain. It was not a debt. It was not a prelude to violence. It was just a fact, as simple and solid as the stone hearth beneath her. That answer stayed with her, settling in her chest like the first warm stone of a new foundation. The snow held for 2 weeks, a white, frozen sea that locked the cabin in silence. Lainey healed. It was a slow, painful process. The blisters on her feet and hands broke, wept, and then, under Nathaniel's persistent care with the salve, began to scab and harden. The raw, skeletal look left her face, replaced by the soft flesh of returning health. She began to move about the cabin, her steps cautious, as if she were testing the floorboards, uncertain if they would hold her weight. She started to work. It was a compulsion. She could not bear to be idle, to be a burden. She had to earn the food she ate, the warmth from the fire. She swept the floors, scoured his blackened cookpots with sand, and melted snow for bathwater. She was quiet, a shadow moving through his small, masculine space. Her movements were haunted. She existed in a state of constant, humming vigilance. Nathaniel watched her. He would sit at his table, mending a harness or sharpening his knives, and he would watch her from under his heavy brows. He watched the way she flinched when he dropped a log into the wood box. He watched how her hands, raw and chapped, would tremble when she reached for the hot kettle. He saw her eyes dart to the door every time the wind rattled the latch, a panicked, cornered animal look. It was not suspicion that made him watch. It was a deep, unsettling curiosity that was fast turning into a protective instinct. He saw the bruises on her soul, and they angered him. He felt a growing, unwelcome longing. It was the simple, human ache for connection, an ache he had starved for 5 years. He would look at the pale, smooth skin of her throat as she bent over the hearth, and he would feel a tightening in his chest. He would curse himself, turn back to his work, and grip the harness leather until his knuckles turned white. One morning, he found her staring out the window, her body rigid. He followed her gaze. His horses, Bess and Amos, were in the lean-to, visible from the kitchen. She was staring at Amos, the big gelding. "He's a gentle horse," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet, trying not to startle her. She jumped anyway, her shoulders hunching. She did not turn. "He's big." "He wouldn't hurt you." She wrapped her arms around her stomach. "Big things. They step on you, even when they don't mean to." He understood she was not just talking about the horse. She would not go near them. When he went to the lean-to feed them, she stayed in the cabin. She was terrified of their size, their heavy, stomping hooves, the way they blew steam from their nostrils. She flinched at any sudden, heavy sound, the thump of his boots on the porch, the crack of an axe splitting wood, the metallic slam of the stove door. Each one made her recoil. And she would not meet his gaze. If she caught him looking, she would immediately drop her eyes to the floor, to her hands, anywhere but his face. It was the gaze of a person who had learned that being seen was dangerous, that to be noticed was to be hurt. The distance between them was measured in these small terrors. He lived in the same 10 square feet with her, but she was a mile away. One evening, the cabin was stuffy with the heat of the fire and the smell of the jerky stew she was simmering. She was stirring the pot, her back to him. He was cleaning his rifle, the familiar, methodical task a comfort in the charged silence. "I've been thrown away before." Her voice was so low he barely heard it. He stopped rubbing the oilcloth on the barrel. He did not speak, sensing that any word from him would shatter the fragile moment. She kept stirring, her knuckles white on the wooden spoon. "When I was a girl, my PA, my real PA, he left, just walked out. My ma said he was chasing gold. I always figured he was just running from us." She stopped stirring and leaned her forehead against the cool stone of the chimney. "Then Jed, he was all right when Ma was alive. But after—" Her voice broke. She took a ragged breath. "He looked at me like I was dirt, like I was something he'd stepped in. He told me I ate too much. He told me I was useless." Nathaniel carefully set the rifle barrel down. He looked at the rigid line of her back, the thinness of her shoulders under the boy's shirt he had given her. "This time," she whispered, "this time, when he threw me out, I nearly died for it. He took my coat." She said it with such finality, such hollow acceptance, that it chilled him to the bone. He took my coat, an act of casual murder. He wanted to rise, to go to her, to put his hand on her shoulder. He wanted to tell her that she was not dirt, that she was not useless. But the words were stuck. He was a man of action, not comfort. His comforts were buried on a hill in Laramie. He remembered Sarah. He remembered her screaming, her hand crushing his, her eyes wide with terror and pain. He remembered the city doctor, drunk and useless, shrugging. He remembered the suffocating weight of his own failure. He had been strong enough to build a ranch, but not strong enough to save his wife, not strong enough to hold his own son. He had walled himself off from attachment. Attachment was pain. Attachment was loss. He had kept his heart frozen, like the land around him. And now this girl, this piece of human driftwood, was thawing him out. He was furious at the feeling. He was terrified of it. He cleared his throat. It sounded loud in the small room. "The snow will melt," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "He can't get to you here." She turned. Her eyes were dry, but her face was a mask of old grief. She nodded once, then went back to stirring the stew. A week passed. The unspoken confession hung in the air between them. Lainey began to sleep in the small loft above the main room, a space he had cleared for her among the stored pelts and drying herbs. It gave her privacy. It gave them both a necessary distance. One night, he came in from the barn, shaking the wet, heavy snow from his coat. The weather was turning, the first hint of a thaw in the air. Lainey was waiting for him, not by the fire, but standing near the table. She was hiding something in her hands. "Mr. Holt?" "Lainey." He hung his coat on the peg. She stepped forward, her eyes on the floor. I found some things in the trunk, in the loft." He tensed. "My wife's trunk." I didn't touch the dresses," she said quickly, her voice panicked. There was an old shirt of yours, ripped, and some flannel scraps. I made you this." She held out her hands. It was a scarf. It was pieced together from gray flannel and the dark blue wool of an old shirt. The stitches were small, tight, but uneven. It was thick and dense, clearly made for warmth, not beauty. He stared at it. No one had made him anything in 5 years. He had bought what he needed, or he had done without. He reached out and took it from her. The flannel was soft, clean. "It's not very good," she whispered, ashamed. "The stitches are crooked." "It's fine," he said, his voice gruff. He felt an awkward tenderness that embarrassed him. He folded it and set it on the table. "Thank you." She looked disappointed, as if she had expected him to throw it back at her. She nodded, then quickly climbed the ladder to the loft, disappearing into the shadows. Nathaniel stood by the table for a long time. He picked up the scarf. He ran his thumb over the seams. He thought of her small, scarred hands pushing a needle through the thick cloth. Hour after hour, in the dim light of the loft. The next morning, Lainey came down the ladder to find him already by the door, pulling on his coat. The old, moth-eaten red scarf he always wore was still on its peg. Wrapped twice around his neck, tucked deep into the collar of his coat, was her gray flannel scarf. He opened the door, letting in a rush of cold, damp air. He did not look at her, but as he stepped out onto the porch, Lainey, who was standing by the stove, smiled. It was not a real smile. It was the faint, watery ghost of one, a bare lifting of the corners of her mouth. But it was the first. The thaw came in earnest. The world turned to a dripping, running, muddy mess. The valley, once silent, was now filled with the roar of the creek as it broke its icy bonds. The snow slid from the roof of the cabin in great, heavy sheets. They needed wood. The storm had felled a large pine up the slope, and the wood pile was shrinking. They worked together. He showed her how to use the two-man saw. "Just pull," he instructed, his hands on the wooden handle opposite hers. "Don't ride it. Let the teeth work. Pull and relax." They found a rhythm, the hiss-shuck of the blade biting into the wet wood. It was hard, straining work. Her arms ached, and her breath came in ragged clouds. But she did not complain. She set her jaw and pulled, her thin body thrown into the effort. He watched her, a grudging respect growing in him. She was not soft. Whatever else, she was not soft. They spent the afternoon splitting the rounds he sawed. He would sink the heavy maul into the wood, and she would gather the split pieces, stacking them against the cabin wall to dry. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth. He reached for a heavy, knotted piece of wood at the same time she did. His large, gloved hand covered hers completely. He felt her small fingers against his palm. She gasped, a tiny, sharp intake of breath. He froze. She froze. He could feel the tremor starting in her hand. But she did not pull away. He did not pull away. It was a long second. The only sound was the drip of water from the eaves. He looked at her. She was staring at their hands, her face pale. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand. He picked up a different piece of wood. She grabbed the one they had touched and hurried to the wood pile. But the charge was there. A line had been crossed. The tension in the cabin grew thick, like smoke. The silent meals were no longer empty. They were charged with unspoken things. He was aware of the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. She was aware of the sound he made when he drank his coffee. They sat at the small table, the lantern light between them, surrounded by a silence that hummed. The long looks by the fire became more frequent. She would be mending his socks, her head bent, the firelight catching the red highlights in her dark hair. He would be reading his almanac, but the words blurred. He would look up and find her watching him, her eyes wide and curious, no longer just afraid. She would blush and look down, but not before he saw the question in her gaze. Even the barn became a shared space. She had, with time, grown used to the chickens. One afternoon, he found her standing in the doorway of the lean-to, just watching him brush down Bess. "Come here," he said, his voice soft. She hesitated, then took 2 small steps inside. "Give me your hand." She held it out, trembling. He took her hand, his bare, warm hand on her bare, cold one, and placed it flat on the horse's broad neck. "Feel that," he said. "She's just warm. She's just a big, warm animal." Lainey stroked the horse's flank, her fear melting into wonder. "She's soft." A small, quiet laugh escaped her. It was the first time he had heard it. The sound was like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. He stood beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. They stood like that for a full minute, 2 quiet figures and a horse, sharing the same space, the same warmth. That night, the work was done. The cabin was clean. A rabbit she had snared was stewing on the stove, filling the room with a rich scent. It had been a good day, a day of shared, productive work. Nathaniel, feeling the thaw inside him as well as outside, did something he had not done in years. He pulled the bottle of whiskey from the shelf. He poured 2 fingers into his tin cup. He looked at her. "Would you, a sip?" he asked. "To warm the bones." She looked surprised, then nodded. He poured a tiny amount, no more than a spoonful, into her cup and filled the rest with hot water from the kettle. He sat at the table. She sat across from him. He raised his cup. "To the thaw." She raised hers. "To the thaw." She sipped and coughed, her eyes watering, fanning her mouth. He let out a low chuckle. "It's got a kick." "It does," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He began to talk. He told her stories of the mountains, of trapping beaver in a high valley, of the time he'd been caught in a rock slide. He did not talk of Sarah. He did not talk of the empty years. He talked about the land. She listened. She watched his face, her eyes intent, her fear momentarily forgotten. She saw the lines around his eyes, the way his gray eyes seemed to soften when he spoke of the wilderness. He found himself watching her. He watched the way her lips parted when she listened. He watched the firelight flicker across the smooth line of her jaw. Her hair was down, loose around her shoulders, clean and dark. He stopped talking. The silence rushed back in, but it was soft now, intimate, A strand of her hair had fallen across her cheek, clinging to her skin. He acted without thought. The 5 years of loneliness, the growing protective urge, the simple, undeniable desire, it all converged in a single movement. He reached across the table. She went utterly still. She watched his hand come toward her, her eyes wide, her body braced for a strike. But his hand was slow. His touch, when it came, was not a grab. It was a whisper. His rough, calloused fingertips brushed her cheek. They were warm. He gently, so gently, tucked the stray hair behind her ear. She let out a breath she had been holding for a lifetime. A violent tremor ran through her entire body, but she did not pull back. She did not flinch. She closed her eyes, her long, dark lashes brushing her cheek. She leaned into his touch, a movement so slight it was barely perceptible. His hand lingered, his fingers resting on the soft skin by her temple. He could feel the frantic pulse beating there. His own heart was a hammer against his ribs. She opened her eyes. The fear was still there, a deep, dark shadow, but it was mixed with something else, a wild, desperate, raw longing that matched his own. Their faces were inches apart. He could smell the clean, faint scent of lye soap on her skin. "I won't hurt you," he whispered. The words were a promise, a vow he hadn't known he was capable of making. She searched his face, her gaze darting between his eyes, looking for the lie. She found none. Slowly, her eyes fixed on his, she began to lean forward, her lips parted. He moved to meet her. She snapped. The terror, held at bay for these few seconds, crashed over her. It was too much, too fast, too soon. She made a small, choked sound, a gasp of pure panic. She threw herself backward, her chair scraping hard against the floor and tipping over with a crash. "I can't," she whimpered, her hands flying to her mouth. "I'm sorry, I can't." Before he could speak, before he could even lower his hand, she turned and fled. She scrambled up the ladder to the loft, her stockinged feet slipping on the rungs. He heard her throw herself onto the cot. He heard the muffled, agonizing sound of her sobbing into the thin mattress. Nathaniel sat alone at the table, his hand still suspended in the empty air where she had been. He slowly lowered it, his fist clenching on the tabletop. He had pushed, he had ruined it. He had taken her kindness, her tentative trust, and proven himself to be just another man, guided by a simple, base hunger. He looked at the whiskey bottle, his face hard and cold. He stood, blew out the lantern, and let the darkness and the sound of her weeping fill the room. For 2 days, the cabin was colder than it had been during the blizzard. The silence returned, but it was no longer neutral. It was a jagged, heavy thing, full of sharp edges and unspoken words. Lainey stayed in the loft. She only came down when she heard the cabin door close and the sound of his axe fade into the distance. She would scramble down the ladder, her movements hurried and furtive. Like a mouse, she would use the privy, grab a hunk of cold bread, refill the water bucket, and flee back to the shadows above. She was suffocating in shame. It was a hot, filthy feeling that coated her skin. He had touched her. He had looked at her with something other than pity or clinical distance. He had looked at her like a woman, and she had leaned into it. That was the worst part. She had wanted it. She had felt a spark, a desperate, traitorous flicker of desire. And then the panic had come, the cold, greasy memory of other hands, other men, other intentions. Jed's voice, thick with whiskey, echoed in her head. "You ain't nothing, girl. You're spoiled goods. Nobody wants what's been used." She believed him. She was soiled. She was ruined. Nathaniel Holt was a good man, a quiet man. He had saved her life, and she had repaid him by letting him touch her. She was convinced he was disgusted. He must have seen the dirt on her, the stain. His kindness had been a mistake, and her response had proven her base nature. She cried into her mattress until her eyes were swollen shut. Nathaniel felt the distance like a physical wall. He blamed himself. Entirely. He had seen the terror in her eyes, the way she braced herself, and he had reached for her anyway. He had pushed. He had broken the fragile, tentative peace they had built. He had proven himself no better than the men who had bruised her. The sound of her sobbing in the loft, the muffled, desperate sounds of her pain, had kept him awake all night, staring at the ceiling, his hands clenched into fists. He retreated. He gave her the space she was so obviously craving. He grabbed his heaviest axe, his rifle, and a skin of water. He left the cabin at dawn and did not return until well after dusk. Pushing himself high up the ridge where the snow was still deep, he attacked the wood. He worked until his shoulders screamed and his hands were raw, felling dead pines, splitting the wood with a violence that was aimed at himself. He was chopping trees, but he was thinking of her face, the way she flinched, the way she had fled. He was a fool, a lonely, clumsy fool. On the third morning, the muddy trail to town looked passable. They were low on flour and coffee, and the horses needed oats. He stood at the bottom of the ladder, his back to the loft. "I'm riding to Bridger's Fork," he said, his voice flat. "Need supplies. I'll be back by dark." He heard a rustle from above. "All right," she whispered to the floorboards. He saddled Amos, leaving Bess in the lean-to. He could not take the wagon. The creek was running too high at the crossing. He would have to make do with what he could strap to the saddle. The ride was 8 miles of sucking mud and melted snow. It took him near 3 hours. Bridger's Fork was not much of a town. It was a muddy street with a general store, a saloon, a livery, and a sour-faced blacksmith. It was a place where people minded their own business, usually. Nathaniel tied Amos to the rail in front of Croft's General Mercantile. He stomped the mud off his boots and went inside. The store smelled of cured tobacco, pickles, and damp wool. Silas Croft was behind the counter, polishing a pair of spectacles. He was a thin man with a thin mouth and eyes that judged everything they saw. "Holt," he said, his greeting clipped. "Silas." Nathaniel handed him the list. "Flour, coffee, salt, 20 pounds of oats." Silas looked at the list. He did not move. He set his spectacles down and folded his hands on the counter. "Heard you had company out at your place," Silas said. His voice was low, confidential. Nathaniel felt his shoulders tense. "Just the supplies, Silas. Folks are talking. Nathaniel, they're saying you pulled a girl out of the snow. A girl from Jed Miller's shack." "I did." Nathaniel kept his voice even. Silas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a pious whisper. "Holt, you're a God-fearing man. Or you were. You know what kind of girl lived with Jed Miller after his wife passed? You know what he was." "I know what he was," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a growl. "She was his stepdaughter." "She's a whore. Holt." Silas said the word flat, like a judgment. "Jed was selling her to any trapper or railroad man passing through. She's soiled goods. This is a decent town. My wife, the other ladies, they don't like the idea of that kind of trash being so close." Nathaniel's vision narrowed. He gripped the edge of the counter. "She's a girl who near froze to death. She's under my roof. She's under my protection. Now get my supplies." Silas straightened up, his face hardening with the courage of his own righteousness. "I can't. Not on credit, and maybe not for cash. Not while you're harboring her." He pushed the list back across the counter. "The town council talked about it. We don't want her here. You turn her out. Holt, send her on her way. Then you can have your supplies." The silence in the store was absolute. Nathaniel stared at the merchant. He saw the self-satisfaction in the man's eyes, the pleasure he took in enforcing his small, cruel morality. Nathaniel's fury was a cold, clean thing. It did not make him loud. It made him quiet. He leaned across the counter until his face was inches from Croft's. "She stays," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And if you, or your wife, or any of those other decent folk come near my property, I will treat it as a threat. Do you understand me, Silas?" Croft, pale and sweating, nodded. Nathaniel turned without his supplies and walked out. He untied Amos, his movement stiff, and mounted the horse. He rode out of Bridger's Fork, the empty sacks flapping against his saddle. He rode Amos hard, the horse churning mud. The 8 miles back felt like 100. His fury was a hot sickness in his gut. He was not angry at Silas. He was angry at the world. He was angry at Jed Miller. He was angry at a God who would let a thing like this happen. He burst into the cabin, slamming the door so hard the tin cups rattled on the shelf. Lainey was by the hearth, scrubbing a pot. She leapt to her feet, her face white, her eyes wide with terror. She had not seen him this angry. This was the fury she had always known from men. "What is it?" she cried. "What's wrong?" He did not answer. He stalked to the window, his back to her, breathing hard. He was trying to get control. He did not want to scare her, but the rage was too big. "The town," he said, his voice choked. "Bridger's Fork." What did they say?" He turned on her, his face a dark mask. "That hypocrite, that pious little snake, Silas Croft." He spat the words. He said he wouldn't sell me supplies. Said the town don't want you here. He called you." He could not say the word. Lainey did not need him to. She knew. Her face crumpled. The last bit of strength, the small flame that had kindled in her, went out. She sank onto the hearthstone, her body folding in on itself. I've caused you trouble," she whispered. Her voice was dead. "I knew I would. I'm a curse." She stood up, her movements mechanical, numb. She looked around the cabin, as if trying to find something to take, but she owned nothing. She walked toward the peg where her old, torn calico dress still hung, the one he had cut from her body. "I'll go," she said. "I'll leave. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I've caused you enough trouble." She reached for the dress. "No." She did not stop. He crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed her arm. It was not a gentle touch. It was hard, desperate. His fingers dug into her skin, stopping her. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of fear. He saw her flinch, and his grip loosened, but he did not let go. His face was inches from hers, his gray eyes burning. "Don't say that again," he said. His voice was low, shaking with an intensity that terrified her. "Don't you ever say you're leaving? Don't you ever call yourself that?" The force of it, the raw, protective fury on her behalf, broke the last wall inside her. She had been braced for him to agree, to tell her to get out, but he was defending her, and he did not even know. You don't understand," she screamed, the word tearing out of her throat. She was sobbing, great, racking sobs that shook her thin frame. She tried to pull away, but he held her fast. "You don't know. He's right. They're all right." "Lainey, stop." "No, you listen." She was hysterical, beating her free hand against his chest, but it was like hitting a stone wall. You think he just threw me out? He didn't just throw me out. He... She collapsed against him, her legs giving way. He held her up, his hands on her arms. "My ma, she died," Lainey wept, the words tumbling out, incoherent with grief and shame. "She was sick for so long, and Jed, he was fine when she was breathing, but after, he drank. He drank all the time, and he looked at me different." Nathaniel went still. He held her, his expression turning to stone. "He said I had to earn my keep. He hit me, and I didn't know what to do. I just kept the house. I kept cooking. I thought he was just grieving." She was gasping for air, her face buried in his rough wool shirt. Then the night of the storm. He brought men, 2 men from the saloon. They were railroad men, surveyors. They had money. They were drunk. And Jed, he laughed. He pushed me at them. He said, she's young, but she's learned. He tried to sell me." Nathaniel's eyes closed, his fists clenched at his sides, the nails biting into his palms. "I fought," she whispered, her voice raw. I saw the poker by the fire. I grabbed it. I hit Jed. I hit him hard, in the face. I think I broke his nose. The other men, they laughed. They thought it was a game. I just ran. I ran out the door. I didn't have my coat. I didn't have anything. I just ran into the snow. I ran until I couldn't feel my feet." She finished. The story was told. She was empty. She sagged in his arms, waiting for the final rejection, waiting for the disgust. Nathaniel said nothing. His face was pale. His jaw locked so tight a muscle jumped. He was shaking, not with sorrow, with a rage so profound, so murderous, it choked him. He could feel Jed Miller's face under his fist. He could feel the railroad men's throats in his hands. He could not speak. He could not comfort her. He was too close to violence. Gently, mechanically, he set her on her feet. She stumbled and caught herself on the table. He turned. He walked to the door, pulled it open, and strode out into the muddy afternoon. He did not take his coat. Lainey watched him go. She sank to the floor, her body numb. He was gone. She knew, with a certainty that settled in her gut like a cold stone, that he was not coming back. He knew the truth. He knew what she was. He had gone to town, and now he would keep going. He would ride to Laramie, or Cheyenne. He would leave the ranch, the cabin, and her. She did not cry. She was beyond tears. She sat on the cold floor and waited. The afternoon light faded. The cabin grew cold. The fire in the hearth burned down to orange embers, then gray ash. She did not move to feed it. She just sat, staring at the door. Twilight fell, painting the room in shades of blue and purple. Then, total darkness. She must have been sitting there for 4 or 5 hours. She was stiff, her bones aching. She heard a sound, a boot scraping on the porch. The door latch lifted. Nathaniel filled the doorway. He was a dark silhouette against the last, faint glow of the evening sky. He stepped inside and closed the door, plunging the room back into blackness. She heard him breathing, heavy, ragged breaths. His return jolted her from her stupor. He was back. He had come back. She scrambled to her feet. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely strike the match. The lantern flared, illuminating the room. He was drenched. His shirt was soaked through, plastered to his chest. His hair was wet, matted to his head. He was covered in mud from the knees down. He had not taken a horse. He had been walking. He had been walking for hours, in the cold, wet thaw, burning off the rage that had threatened to consume him. He looked exhausted. The fury was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, profound weariness. He looked at her, his gray eyes raw. Lainey did not speak. She went to the hearth. She piled kindling, her hands fumbling, and blew on the embers until a small flame caught. She added larger logs. The fire crackled, filling the room with light and warmth. She went to the stove, filled the kettle, and set it on to heat. He had not moved. He stood by the door, dripping onto the floor, watching her. She made tea, the strong, black tea he favored. Her hands shook so much the tin cup rattled against the kettle. She brought it to him. He looked at the cup, then at her. He took it. His own hands were trembling. He drank, the hot liquid scalding. He set the empty cup on the table. "Lainey," he said. His voice was soft, ragged. She flinched, waiting for the verdict. He took a step toward her. "You don't owe me anything." His voice was thick. "Not for the food, not for the wood, not for pulling you out of the snow. You don't owe me a thing." She just stared at him, unable to process the words. He took another step. He was close now, close enough for her to feel the cold dampness coming off his clothes. "But I want you to stay," he said. That was it, the simple fact. I want you to stay." The words broke the spell. This was her choice. This was not something happening to her. He was not claiming her. He was asking. She looked at his face. She saw the exhaustion. She saw the lines of old grief for his wife, his child, and she saw the new pain, the pain he felt for her. Slowly, her hand trembling, she reached up. She did not know why she was doing it. She needed to know he was real. She pressed her palm against his cheek. His beard was rough, cold, and wet with melted snow. He closed his eyes, his entire body shuddering. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he left. When he opened his eyes, they were clear. He did not grab her. He did not seize her. His arms came up and wrapped around her waist, pulling her against his cold, damp body. He buried his face in her hair, his arms locking around her, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. But it was not a violent hold. It was a desperate one. It was the hold of a drowning man. After what Jed had done, after what the town had said, he had expected her to be gone. He had walked into the dark cabin and his heart had stopped, believing his rage had finally driven her away. But she was still there. She did not panic. She did not fight. She felt the solid, living strength of him. And she melted. Her arms, which had been trapped between them, fought their way free and wrapped around his thick neck. She clung to him. She buried her face in his shoulder, inhaling the scent of wet wool, pine, and the clean, cold night. He pulled back just enough to look at her. He lowered his head. Their first kiss was a collision of cold and warmth. It was gentle. It was hesitant. It was clumsy. It was full of unshed tears. His lips were chapped. Hers were trembling. It tasted of salt. He was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and the world dissolved. It was not a kiss of passion, not yet. It was a kiss of recognition. It was a kiss that said, "I see you. You are not alone." He pulled her closer, his hand tangling in her hair, tilting her head. The kiss deepened. The hesitation burned away, replaced by a sudden, fierce need. A need that had been starving in him for 5 empty years. A need in her that had never, ever been answered. It was raw. It was honest. He broke the kiss, his breathing ragged. He looked at her, his eyes dark. He did not ask. He did not need to. He bent, sliding one arm under her legs and the other behind her back, and lifted her as easily as he had lifted her from the snow. She gasped, her arms tightening around his neck. He carried her the few steps to his bed in the corner of the room. He laid her on the thick wool blankets, the ones that held his scent. He did not rush. He stood over her, his shadow cast by the firelight, and he began to unbutton his wet shirt. She watched him. She was afraid, but it was a new kind of fear. It was the fear of the unknown, not the terror of the known. He knelt by the bed. He did not touch her body. He touched her face. He cupped her jaw in his large, warm hand. "Lana," he whispered, her name a prayer. He touched the collar of the boy's shirt she wore. He waited. She gave a small, trembling nod. His fingers, which were so strong they could split oak, were agonizingly gentle as they undid the buttons. Every touch was emotional. Every brush of his skin against hers was a question, "Is this all right?" Every shiver of her body was the answer. Yes. This was not the greedy fumbling of Jed's men. This was not a transaction. This was a discovery. He unwrapped her not like a man claiming property, but like a man unwrapping a precious, broken thing he intended to heal. She touched him, too. Her shy, scarred hands explored the hard muscles of his chest, the rough hair, the warmth of his skin. She was trembling, but she was not recoiling. She was learning. They came together in the firelight. 2 broken, lonely people. It was raw. It was honest. It was awkward and real. It was a desperate clinging, a wordless promise to erase the cold. For him, it was a waking from a long, dead sleep. For her, It was the first time a man's touch had meant anything other than pain. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets. The fire was roaring, and the cabin was safe and warm. She was pressed against his side, her head on his chest, his arm heavy and secure around her shoulders. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart beneath her ear. The wind sighed outside, but it could not get in. She was warm. She was whole. She let out a long, quiet breath, a sound of such profound release it made him hold her tighter. "I've never," she whispered, her voice so low he barely heard it, her lips moving against his skin. "I've never felt safe like this." Spring came to the High Valley not as a gentle guest, but as a violent thaw. The world turned to mud. The creek, choked with ice, became a brown, roaring river that tore at its banks. The snow receded up the mountainsides, leaving behind a raw, wet earth that smelled of pine and decay, and, underneath it all, the first sharp promise of new grass. For Lainey, the change in the land was a change in her blood. She felt an itch in her palms, a need to dig, to plant. She had spent her life trying to survive. Now, she felt the strange, unfamiliar urge to grow something. In the back of the cabin, in a dry, neglected crate, she found Nathaniel's memories of a different life. There were small, cloth bags of dried-up seeds, a woman's gardening gloves, and a tarnished trowel. She took the seeds, beans, squash, and some hardy corn, and soaked them in a cup of water, praying they still held life. She found a patch of land near the south-facing wall of the cabin, where the sun hit strongest. She took a shovel and began to turn the soil. It was hard, rocky work. The ground was stubborn, still half frozen, but she attacked it with a quiet ferocity. Nathaniel found her at dusk, her face streaked with mud, her hands raw, but a small 10-by-10 patch of earth was dark and ready. He stood watching her for a long time. She was not just digging in the dirt. She was claiming a piece of this place. She was putting down roots. He had slept on the hearth, and then on a bedroll. Since she had come, he had given her his bed, his room. But it was not her room. It was the cabin, which had been his solitary fortress, was now a shared space. And it was too small for the life that was growing inside it. The next morning, he did not go up the ridge to check his traps. He went to the stand of lodgepole pine behind the barn and began to fell trees. He was building an addition. He worked with a focused, silent energy. Lainey, seeing his purpose, put down her seeds and came to help. He taught her how to score the logs, how to chink the gaps with mud and moss. He built a new room off the side of the cabin, one with its own small hearth and a window frame. It was a proper bedroom. It was her room. As they worked, the walls of their new life went up, literal and figurative. Their love, born in the dark, desperate night of her confession, began to settle. It deepened. It found a rhythm. Mornings were no longer silent. They were filled with the sound of the stove lid rattling, the smell of coffee. They would sit at the table, his big, rough hands wrapped around a tin cup, hers small and scarred around her own. They would talk, not of the past, but of the day. The roof of the lean-to needed mending. The beans were sprouting. A fox had been seen near the chickens. There were moments of startling, simple joy. Lainey had never known joy. She had known relief and survival, but not this light, bubbling thing. One afternoon, a hen got loose, and Nathaniel, trying to corner it, tripped over the woodpile and landed flat on his back in the mud. Lainey, watching from the porch, clapped a hand over her mouth. A sound came out of her, a sudden, clear, bright peal of laughter. Nathaniel, lying in the mud, looked up. He had never heard her laugh. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He broke into a wide, slow grin, and the laughter, seeing his smile, came out of her again. Stronger this time. He lay there for a long minute, just to hear it. Their nights were a different kind of discovery. The tentative, tear-stained comfort of their first night had burned away, replaced by a deep, powerful current of passion. His bed was their sanctuary. He learned the map of her body, the scars he traced with his lips, the places that made her shiver, the way she cried out his name when he finally took her. She, in turn, learned his strength. She learned that she could be touched not with violence, but with a fierce, protective reverence. She learned to meet his hunger with her own, a wild, untamed thing she never knew she possessed. But the fear remained. It was a shadow that lived inside her. Even in the brightest moments, she would be standing at the stove, humming, and the sound of a branch snapping in the woods would make her freeze, her heart leaping into her throat. One night, they were lying in bed, the fire painting shadows on the log walls. She was curled against his side, her head on his chest. "It's too good, Nat," she whispered into the darkness. He stroked her hair. "What is?" "This, the room, the sun on the dirt." She lifted her head. He could barely see her face, but he could feel the tremor in her voice. "It feels like something I borrowed, like someone's going to come and ask for it back. I don't know how to belong to a thing like this. I'm still the girl from that shack." He held her tighter. "That girl is gone. You're here. You're Lainey Holt." He said it without thinking. He had given her his name, not in a church, but in his heart. "This is your home. No one is taking it from you. No one is taking you from me." She wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to. But she knew that men like Jed Miller did not let go. The pelts had been piling up since fall. Beaver, fox, and a few marten. They were cured, dry, and worth money. And they needed money. They needed glass for the new window, more ammunition, salt, sugar, and trousers for Lainey that were not his old, cut-down ones. Nathaniel had put off the trip. He would not go back to Bridger's Fork. He would not give Silas Croft the satisfaction. Nor would he leave Lainey alone long enough for the town's decent folk to get any ideas. But 20 miles to the east, along the rail line, was a bigger trading post. A rougher, more anonymous town called Rawlins. He left at first light, armed with his rifle and 2 pistols. Lainey stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around her stomach. He kissed her. A hard, quick kiss. "I'll be back before the moon is high. Bolt the door. Keep the rifle close." She nodded, her face pale. She watched him ride Amos until he disappeared into the pines. Rawlins was a town of mud, whiskey, and men who did not ask questions. Nathaniel sold his pelts for a good price at the depot, pocketing over $100 in coin. He bought his supplies, strapping them to a pack mule he'd borrowed from a neighbor miles down the valley. His last stop was the saloon. He needed a beer, and he needed to listen. He needed to know if the talk from Bridger's Fork had spread. The saloon was dark, smelling of stale beer and sawdust. He took a table in the corner, his back to the wall. He nursed his drink, his ears open. He heard them before he saw them. A man at the bar was talking, his voice smooth and carrying, unlike the rough grunts of the other drinkers. "A simple matter," the man said. $50, coin, for information leading to the girl. Another 50 for her return. She's not much, dark hair, thin, answers to Lainey. She's a runaway indentured girl, stole a horse and money from her guardian. Nathaniel's hand tightened on his mug. He looked. The man was dressed in a dark waistcoat and a bowler hat. He wore a pearl-handled pistol, high on his hip, tied down. He was not a drifter. He was a professional, a bounty hunter. The bartender, a burly man polishing a glass, grunted. "Jed Miller's girl. Heard she froze." "Rumors," the bounty hunter said, sipping his whiskey. "Miller says she's clever. She'd find shelter. She was seen heading toward the high valleys. Someone might have taken her in." He smiled, a thin, cold expression. "Harboring a fugitive is a serious offense. This is a legal matter. I have the papers." Nathaniel's blood turned to ice. Indentured girl. Stole a horse. Jed had been smart. He hadn't reported an assault. He had reported a crime. He had made Laney a piece of property, and anyone helping her a criminal. Nathaniel finished his beer in one long, slow swallow. He stood, his chair scraping quietly. He walked out of the saloon, his face a mask of stone. He collected his mule and rode hard, pushing Amos faster than he should have on the muddy trail. Laney saw him coming. She ran from the porch, her relief so bright it hurt him to look at her. "You're back," she breathed, grabbing the horse's bridle. "I'm back," he said, swinging down. He did not kiss her. He began unstrapping the supplies, his movements sharp, angry. She saw his face, the joy drained from hers. "Nathaniel, what is it? What happened?" He waited until the supplies were inside, until the door was shut. The new glass for her window was wrapped in canvas on the table. He did not look at it. "You were right," he said, his voice flat. "Right about what?" "Jed Miller. He didn't give up." He turned to face her. "He's hired a man, a bounty hunter. I saw him in Rawlins. He's offering a reward, $50. Laney's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes went wide with a terror he had not seen since the first day. But how?" "He's smart," Nathaniel said, his voice bitter. "He told them you're an indentured girl, said you stole money and a horse. He has papers. He's made you a criminal." Laney turned white. She backed away from him, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "No, no, no, no!" She saw it all. The ranch, the cabin, the horses, his freedom. All of it. Gone. Because of her. "I have to go," she said, her voice a low, terrified keen. She began to look around, frantic. "I have to go, right now. He'll find me here. He'll take you. They'll put you in jail for harboring, oh God, Nat." She grabbed the old flannel scarf she had made him, clutching it to her chest. "I'll go north. I'll go to the mountains. He won't find me." She was crying, her body shaking. "You saved me. You saved me. Don't let me be the one who ruins you. Please, you have to let me go." He watched her, his face hard, his eyes burning. He let her panic, let her see the edges of the nightmare. When she reached for the door latch, he moved. He did not grab her. He put his body between her and the door. He put his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm, unyielding. "No." The word was an iron bar. "But, Nat, he'll take everything." "Let him try." His voice was a low growl. "You are not running. Not ever again. This is your home. That man, that bounty hunter. If he sets one foot in this valley, I will bury him in it. He is not touching you." You'll be a criminal," she sobbed, her hands beating against his chest. He caught her wrists. He held them. "Then I'll be a criminal. I don't care. I'd rather lose this ranch than lose you. Do you understand me? I will not lose you." She stared at him, her tears freezing on her face. She saw the absolute, terrifying sincerity in his eyes. He meant it. He would burn his whole life down before he let her go. The next morning, the air was different. The threat was no longer a shadow. It was a living thing, watching them from the trees. Nathaniel took his spare rifle from the pegs above the door. It was a Winchester .73, lighter than his buffalo gun, but accurate. He handed it to her. She held it, the wooden stock and cold steel feeling impossibly heavy, deadly. "You need to learn how to use this," he said. "I can't be everywhere." He took her 100 yards from the cabin, by the creek. He set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log. He stood behind her, his body close, his hand over hers on the stock. "Brace it, tight, into your shoulder," he instructed, his voice low and calm. "Or it will kick you. Hard. Line up the front sight in the notch of the back one. Breathe out and squeeze. Don't pull." She was shaking. The gun felt wrong, loud, violent. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The rifle bucked like a mule, slamming into her shoulder, knocking her off balance. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet to the left of the log. "Again," he said, his voice patient. "Open your eyes. Look at your target. Don't be afraid of the noise. Be the one making it." She loaded. She braced herself, her jaw set. She breathed. She aimed. She squeezed. The shot was closer. She worked the lever, the spent cartridge ejecting. She did it again and again. For an hour, the valley echoed with the sharp crack of the rifle. She was a good student. She was a still, quiet person, and she brought that stillness to the weapon. "All right," he said. "On your own." She nodded. She loaded the rifle, raised it to her shoulder, braced her feet in the mud. She sighted down the barrel. The world narrowed to the front sight and the small, distant can. She let out her breath. She squeezed. The can leaped into the air, spinning, and landed in the creek. She lowered the rifle, her arms aching. Nathaniel was staring at her, a slow, surprised smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice full of respect. "You're a natural—" Lainey looked at her own hands, which were holding the heavy rifle. They were rock steady. "When I picked up that poker," she said, her voice quiet, I wasn't shaking then either. I was just angry." He nodded, understanding. "Good, stay angry." A few nights later, the weather turned. A furious spring storm rolled down from the high peaks. It was not snow, but a cold, driving rain, laced with thunder that echoed off the valley walls like cannon fire. The new room was finished, the glass window in place, but they still slept in his bed. It was their island. Lainey lay awake, the rifle beside the bed, listening to the thunder. The sound was too much like the gunshots. The storm passed near midnight, as suddenly as it had come. The silence it left behind was heavy, dripping. Lainey, restless, realized the space beside her was empty. "Nathaniel?" She sat up. The bed was cold. She heard no sound from the cabin. A prickle of fear ran up her spine. She grabbed her nightgown, slid from the bed, and ran to the main room. He was not there. The cabin door was open. "Nat!" She ran out onto the porch. The air was cold, electric, smelling of ozone and wet pine. The creek was a muddy, roaring torrent in the darkness. She saw him. He was standing near the bank, not 50 feet away. He was wearing just his trousers, his shirt long forgotten. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his head. He was standing perfectly still, staring into the rushing water. Then he threw his head back and roared. It was not a word. It was a sound of such profound, animalistic agony that Lainey's blood froze. He screamed into the wind, at the black sky, at the violent, swollen creek. She ran to him, slipping in the mud. "Nathaniel, what is it? What's wrong?" He turned, and his eyes were wild, unseeing. He was not in this night. He was in another. "It was a night like this," he gasped, his voice cracking. "The rain, the creek. It was too high. I couldn't cross. I couldn't get the doctor." He grabbed his head, his fingers digging into his own hair. Sarah, she was burning with the fever. She kept calling my name. And the baby," his voice broke. "He was so small. He was just so small. He came too soon. He just stopped. He stopped breathing. And I was trapped on the other side of the creek, listening to her scream." The story came out of him, torn from his gut. He had never told anyone. He had buried them. He had buried his wife and his infant son on the hill, and he had buried his grief so deep inside himself it had petrified. He collapsed, his legs gave out, and he fell to his knees in the cold, thick mud. The scream was gone, replaced by the sound that Lainey had never heard from him. He was crying, great, deep, tearing sobs that shook his entire body. He was weeping for the first time in 5 years, for the wife he couldn't save and the child he never got to hold. Lainey did not hesitate. She did not speak. There were no words for this. She went to him. She knelt in the mud, in the cold, her thin nightgown instantly soaked. She wrapped her arms around his broad, shaking shoulders. She pulled his head to her chest. She held him as he wept, rocking him gently, her own tears mixing with the rain on his hair. She was an anchor. She was the one thing in his world that was not being washed away. He cried for a long time. The storm clouds broke, and a sliver of pale moonlight cut through, illuminating them, 2 broken figures, kneeling in the mud, clinging to each other. Finally, the sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. He lifted his head. His face was wrecked, washed clean of the poison he had held for so long. He looked at her, his eyes clear, raw, and full of a vulnerable love that stole her breath. He stood, pulling her up with him. They were both covered in mud, drenched, and shaking with cold. He did not lead her to the bed. He did not go to the fire. He pulled her against him, right there in the main room, his hands tangling in her wet hair. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of comfort. It was a kiss of overwhelming, desperate need. He tore her nightgown from her shoulder. She ripped his wet trousers open. They fell to the bearskin rug in front of the cold hearth, a tangle of mud and rain and limbs. It was not gentle. It was not slow. It was wordless. It was overwhelming. It was acclaiming, a desperate, raw affirmation of life in the face of so much death. It was fire and ice and rain, and it was the most honest, brutal, and beautiful thing she had ever known. They lay tangled for hours, finally sleeping the sleep of the exhausted. In the deepest part of the night, just before the first hint of dawn, Lainey woke. Her heart was pounding. A dream, a nightmare. Jed's face. She sat up, her body slick with sweat. Nathaniel was breathing deeply beside her, lost to the world. She listened. The cabin was silent. The creek had quieted to a low rumble. Then she heard it. A horse, a soft whicker, quickly shushed. It was not Bess. It was not Amos. She slid from the bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wood floor. She grabbed the rifle. She crept into her new room, to the window. She peered out. The moon was low, but the sky was clear. The valley was bathed in a pale, gray light. And she saw him. A shadow, a man, standing by the barn, half hidden by the corner. He was holding the reins of a horse, keeping it quiet. He was perfectly still. He was looking at the cabin, watching. The rifle was cold in her hands. Lainey's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird in a cage. She did not breathe. She just watched the shadow by the barn. "Nat," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. His name was enough. Nathaniel was awake, moving from the bed to her side in a single, silent motion, his own rifle in his hand. He was naked, his body pale in the moonlight, but he seemed not to notice the cold. He looked past her, out the window. "One man," he breathed. "He's watching." "It's him," Lainey whispered. "The bounty hunter." "Or Miller." "No, he's too still, too patient. Jed is loud." Nathaniel nodded. He recognized the stance. It was the patience of a wolf. This was not a drunken, angry stepfather. This was a professional. This was the man from Rawlins. They stood like that for an hour, 2 statues at the window, watching the man watch them. The sky began to gray in the east. The first cold light of dawn touched the high peaks. As if the light were a signal, the man stepped out from the shadow of the barn. He was not wearing a bowler hat now. He wore a plainsman's hat and a long, dark duster. He walked not to the door, but to the middle of the yard, a clear 50 feet away. He stood with his hands visible, away from his pistol. "Nathaniel Holt," his voice called out, clear and calm in the morning air. "My name is Rook. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Jedediah Miller. I have papers for the girl." Nathaniel pulled on his trousers and his boots. He grabbed his heavy buffalo gun, the sharps, and walked to the door. Lainey was right behind him, her own Winchester in her hands. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Lainey stood in the doorway, the rifle held low, her body half shielded by the doorframe. "Mr." Rook looked at them. He registered Lainey, her pale, determined face. He registered the rifle she held, and the steady way she held it. His gaze shifted to Nathaniel and the massive buffalo gun. His eyes, small and dark, showed a flicker of professional appraisal. This would not be easy. "Mr. Holt," Rook said, his voice polite. "I have a legal warrant for the arrest of one Lana Miller. She is an indentured fugitive, charged with theft of property. I am a bonded agent. I mean you no harm. I just want the girl." He reached into his duster, his movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. He held them up. "This is a lawful matter." Nathaniel did not look at the papers. His eyes were locked on Rook's. "She's not going anywhere," Nathaniel said. His voice was low, a rumble that seemed to come from the ground. Rook sighed, a small, put-upon sound. "Mr. Holt, do not make this difficult. You are harboring a criminal. That makes you a criminal. I am empowered by the Wyoming Territory to use any force necessary. Give me the girl, and you walk away." Nathaniel raised the Sharps rifle. He did not aim it. He just held it, the massive, long-range weapon resting in the crook of his arm. The implication was clear. "Over my dead body," Nathaniel said. Rook stared at him. He looked at Lainey. He looked at the cabin, the well-tended barn, the new room built onto the side. He saw the truth. This was not a man harboring a fugitive. This was a man protecting his wife. The bounty hunter was a practical man. He was paid to retrieve property, not to die for it. He was outnumbered, and clearly outgunned. He gave a small, almost respectful nod. "As you wish." He put the papers back inside his coat. "But you cannot fight the law. Holt, I will be back, and I will have Sheriff Brody and a dozen deputies with me. You will be arrested. And she," he said, his eyes flicking to Lainey with a cold, impersonal malice, "will be returned to Mr. Miller. It is only a matter of time." He turned, his back to them, and walked with unhurried, arrogant confidence to his horse. Still hidden by the barn, he mounted and rode out of the valley, never once looking back. The sound of the hoofbeats faded. Lainey lowered the rifle, her arms shaking so badly she almost dropped it. The strength, the cold anger, drained out of her, leaving a hollow, sickening void. She turned and stumbled back into the cabin. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall. And the breakdown came. It was not the high, keening panic of before. It was a low, guttural sound of absolute despair. "He's right," she choked out, her face in her hands. "He's right. It's over." Nathaniel was beside her, kneeling, his rifle set aside. He tried to put his arms around her, but she pushed him away. "No, don't!" she cried, her voice raw. "Don't you see? He'll be back with the sheriff, the law. He has papers. They'll put you in jail. They'll take the ranch. They'll take Bess and Amos. They'll take everything you've built. Everything." She looked up at him, her face a mask of self-loathing, her eyes swimming in tears. "You'll lose everything. For me, for trash." The word was a stone she threw at herself. Nathaniel's face hardened. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip gentle but inescapable. He made her look at him. "Listen to me," he said, his voice fierce, shaking her just slightly to get through the hysteria. "Listen, this cabin, the horses, the land, it's just wood, it's just dirt. It was empty. It was a grave. Before you, it meant nothing. He put his hand under her chin, lifting her face to his. His gray eyes were on fire. "Then I lose it," he said, the words a vow. "I don't care. I would rather stand in the street with nothing but the shirt on my back, holding your hand, than own this whole valley without you. I would rather lose everything than lose you." She stared at him. She saw the truth. It was terrifying. It was the most beautiful, terrifying thing she had ever seen. He meant it. "Nat," she whispered, her fight gone. He pulled her against his chest and held her, his hand stroking her hair. "We are not running," he said, "and we are not waiting here to be slaughtered. He's going to the sheriff? Good, so are we." She pulled back. "What, go to town? To Bridger's Fork? They hate me there." "Nat, Silas Croft." "I don't care about Silas Croft," he said, his face grim. "I care about the law. That man, Rook, he's got papers. We've got the truth. It's time to see which one weighs more." He stood and pulled her to her feet. "Get dressed. Pack food for one day. We ride now. We get to Brody before he does." The ride to Bridger's Fork was a journey into the heart of their fear. Laney had not been back since the day Nathaniel had been refused supplies. She rode Bess, the mare, her back straight, the Winchester in a scabbard on her saddle. Nathaniel rode Amos, his sharps in its case, his face set like granite. They rode into the single muddy street just before noon. The town went silent. Men on the boardwalk stopped whittling. They stopped talking. They just turned and stared. Laney saw Silas Croft standing in the doorway of his mercantile. He saw her, and a slow, ugly smirk spread across his face. He looked past her, at the empty trail, as if expecting to see a posse. "Mrs. Croft came out to stand beside him, a woman as thin and sour as her husband. She folded her arms, her eyes full of righteous venom. Laney felt her insides turn to water. She wanted to turn Bess around, to flee back to the safety of the valley. She felt Nathaniel's hand on her arm. "Keep your head high," he said, his voice low. "You've done nothing wrong." He led the horses to the sheriff's office, a small, false-fronted building next to the saloon. He dismounted and tied the reins. He helped her down, his hand steady on her waist. They walked inside. The office was small, smelling of stale coffee, tobacco, and the iron of the 3 empty cells in the back. Sheriff Brody was sitting at his desk, his feet up, reading a week-old newspaper. He was a man in his 50s, with a weary face and a drooping mustache. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Holt," he said, swinging his feet to the floor. "What trouble now?" His eyes flicked to Laney, and his face hardened. "You shouldn't be here, girl. Or you, for that matter. I heard Croft ran you off." "We're not here for supplies. Sheriff," Nathaniel said. He stood in the middle of the room, his duster pushed back, his hands resting on his belt, near his pistol. "We're here because a man named Rook, a bounty hunter, came to my ranch this morning." Brody's eyes narrowed. "I know him. He passed through yesterday, filed some papers, indenture warrant for a runaway girl." He looked at Laney. "You—" "The papers are a lie," Nathaniel said. "Are they?" Brody sighed. He stood and walked to his wall cabinet. He pulled out the warrant. "Says here she stole a horse and $50 from Jed Miller. Says she's his legal ward." "He's her stepfather," Nathaniel said, his voice tight. "He tried to sell her to 2 men. She ran for her life. He took her coat and threw her out into a blizzard. I found her half dead." Brody looked at the paper. He looked at Nathaniel. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Holt, that's a hell of a story, but this is a legal document, signed by a judge in Cheyenne. Your story. It's just your story. What proof you got?" "I am the proof," Laney said. Her voice was high, sharp. Both men turned to look at her. She was trembling, but her eyes were blazing. "I am the proof. Sheriff, look at me. Look at the scars on my hands from the frostbite. Ask him. Ask Jed Miller to show you the horse I stole. There is no horse. Ask him to show you where the money was. There is no money. He's a drunk, and he's a monster. He tried to sell me. I hit him with a poker, and I ran. That is the truth." Sheriff Brody stared at her. He had seen liars. He had seen whores. He had seen terrified girls. He was seeing all three, and something more. He was seeing the truth, and it made his stomach hurt. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softening just a fraction, "even if I believe you, and I'm not saying I do, this paper gives Rook the right. My hands are tied." "Are they?" Nathaniel said. "Rook told me he was coming back with you and a dozen deputies. He threatened to take my ranch." Brody's head snapped up. "He what? That arrogant son of a—" "I am the law here. Holt, not him. I don't run posses for bounty hunters. I told him this was a civil matter, and he'd have to wait for the circuit judge." "He's not waiting," Nathaniel said. "He's coming, and he won't be alone." Brody cursed, a long, low string of words. He sat down heavily. He was trapped between a legal but unjust warrant and a good man he respected. "All right," he said, slamming his hand on the desk. "All right. I can't tear up the warrant, but I can hold a public hearing right here, right now. We'll get this settled before it turns to gunplay. I'll send for Rook. I'll send for Miller, though it'll take a day. We'll put it all on the table." "Not Miller," Laney said, her voice low. "Just Rook. Miller. He can't. Please." Brody looked at her, his face full of pity. "All right, girl. We'll start with Rook. I'll hear your testimony against his warrant. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, in the saloon. It's the only place big enough if folks get wind of it." He looked at Nathaniel. "You find a room, and you stay in it. Don't you start trouble. Holt, I mean it." They got a room at the town's only hotel, a small, dusty place above the saloon. The tension in the town was a living thing. As they walked across the street, they could feel the eyes. They were a show. Mrs. Croft, seeing them from her store, stepped out onto the boardwalk. As Laney passed, the woman turned her head and spat into the dust at her feet. Laney flinched, her face burning with shame. "Keep walking," Nathaniel growled. But as they reached the hotel steps, another woman came out of the blacksmith shop. It was Martha, the smith's wife. She was a large, silent woman with powerful arms and a kind face. She was holding a clean bucket of water. She looked at Laney, at her pale, terrified expression. She looked at Mrs. Croft, who was still standing there, sneering. Martha walked past them, and as she did, she gave Laney a small, firm nod. The town was divided. They spent the night in the small, airless room. Neither of them slept. They sat in the dark, Laney on the bed, Nathaniel in the chair by the window, his rifle across his lap, watching the street. Morning came, gray and cold. 9 o'clock. They walked down the stairs and into the saloon. It was full. The whole town was there. Men lined the bar. Farmers and ranchers stood in the back. Silas and Mrs. Croft were in the front, their faces smug. Martha, the blacksmith's wife, was there, too, standing by the wall. Sheriff Brody was at a table at the front. Mr. Rook was there, calm, his papers spread neatly before him. He smirked at Laney as she entered. And then Laney saw him. In the back corner, near the door, was Jed Miller. Her breath hitched. He was not supposed to be here. He was thinner than she remembered. His face scarred where the poker had hit him. His eyes, small and dark, found hers. He smiled, a wet, rotten smile. Rook must have brought him. "All right, folks, settle down," Brody said, his voice loud. "This ain't a circus. This is a hearing. Mr. Rook has a warrant. Miss Lana has a claim. I'm gonna hear 'em both." "It's simple, Sheriff," Rook said, standing. "The girl is a thief. She's indentured. She ran. I'm here to collect her. Her guardian, Mr. Miller, is right there. Ask him." Brody looked at Jed. "Mr. Miller, is this your ward? Did she steal from you?" Jed stepped forward, his hat in his hands, playing the part of the grieving, wronged guardian. "Yes, Sheriff, she did. Stole $50 and my best mare. Broke my heart. After I took her in, fed her, raised her like my own." "You're a liar!" Laney screamed. The sound shocked the room into silence. She walked forward, past Nathaniel, until she was standing in the middle of the room, facing her stepfather. "Tell them," she said, her voice shaking, but loud and clear. "Tell them what you did. Tell them about my mother. Tell them about the men you brought. Tell them how you tried to sell me." Jed's face went from pious to purple. "She's hysterical. Sheriff, she's a whore. She's been living in sin with him." He pointed at Nathaniel. The room erupted. Silas Croft stood up. "See, I told you, filth!" "That's enough," Brody shouted, drawing his pistol and firing a shot into the ceiling. In that instant, Rook acted. This was not going his way. The hearing was a disaster. He was losing his bounty. He pulled his pistol. "Forget this, she's mine." He lunged, not for Laney, but for Nathaniel, striking him in the side of the head with the barrel of the gun. Nathaniel went down, stunned. At the same time, Jed Miller and two other men who had come with him, hard men from the saloon, moved. "Grab her!" Jed roared. It was chaos. The townsfolk scattered. Sheriff Brody was shouting. Jed's men grabbed Laney, their hands rough. One man seized her by the hair, another pinned her arms. "You're coming with us, girl," the man hissed, his face close, his breath hot with whiskey. Laney screamed, a sound of pure, primal rage. She was not the girl in the snow. She was not the girl who hid in the loft. She had the rifle. She had dropped it when Jed appeared, but it was at her feet. She twisted, stomping her boot down on the instep of the man holding her arms. He howled. She ducked her head, ripping her hair from the other man's grasp. She dropped to one knee, grabbed the Winchester, and stood. The man she had stomped was coming at her, his face a mask of rage. He reached for her. She didn't aim. She didn't think. She brought the rifle up and fired from the hip. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed room. The man screamed, a high, thin sound, and grabbed his leg, collapsing to the floor. Nathaniel, shaking his head, was getting to his knees. He saw Rook, his pistol raised, aiming not at Laney, but at him. "Nat!" Laney screamed. Rook fired. Nathaniel cried out, a sharp gasp, and clutched his side, a dark stain spreading through his shirt. He fell back against the bar. "No!" Laney turned. She saw Jed, his face white with terror, trying to flee. She saw Rook, a look of grim satisfaction on his face, turning his pistol toward her. She leveled the rifle, her hands steady, her eyes cold. She aimed it directly at Rook's chest. "Drop it," she said. Her voice was not a girl's. It was a woman's. It was the voice of the valley, of the winter, of the iron rifle. "Or I will kill you." Rook froze. He looked at the gaping black hole of the rifle. He looked at her eyes. He saw no fear. He saw no hesitation. He saw his own death. "That's enough!" Brody's voice boomed. He and two other men had their guns drawn. All pointed at Rook and Jed. "Rook! Miller! Drop your weapons, now!" Slowly, his face contorted with fury, Rook let his pistol clatter to the floor. Jed Miller was already on his knees, his hands in the air, whimpering. The silence that fell was broken only by the man on the floor, moaning, and the sound of Laney, dropping the rifle and scrambling to Nathaniel. "Nat, oh God, Nat." He was slumped against the bar, his hand pressed to his side, his face pale. Blood was welling up between his fingers. "Martha, the blacksmith's wife, pushed through the crowd. "Get him to the hotel, now! Silas, get the doctor! Don't you stand there, you useless old goat! Get him!" The town, forced to reckon, finally moved. They carried Nathaniel to the room. Jed and Rook were dragged to the cells. Laney sat by the bed. The doctor had come and gone. The bullet had gone clean through his side. He had lost blood. Too much blood. But the doctor said he would live. She sat, her hands stained with his blood, and she wept. She wept for the blood, for the fear, for the rage, for the fact that she had shot a man and had not felt a thing. Hours passed. The room grew dark. She was holding his hand. It was still warm. His eyelids flickered. He groaned. "Laney." His voice was a dry, pained whisper. "I'm here," she sobbed, leaning over him. "I'm here. Nat, I'm right here." He opened his eyes. He focused on her face, on her tears. He managed a small, pained smile. His thumb moved, rubbing the back of her hand. "I told you," he whispered. "You're safe now." The first week was a blur of laudanum, fever, and blood-soaked bandages. Laney never left the small hotel room. She slept in the chair, her hand on Nathaniel's arm, waking at every pained breath he took. She spoon-fed him broth, bathed his feverish skin, and changed his dressings with a steady hand that surprised her. She had nursed her mother through the long, slow fate of consumption. She found she was a good nurse when rage was not required. Martha, the blacksmith's wife, became her only ally in the town. She would appear 3 times a day with a pot of hot stew, clean bandages, or just a bucket of fresh water. She never spoke much. She would nod at Laney, look at the sleeping man, and say, "He's strong. He'll mend." Her presence was a silent, solid wall against the whispers and stares of the rest of Bridger's Fork. The town was in an uproar. Sheriff Brody, his face grim, had held Jed Miller and the bounty hunter, Rook, in his cells. The man Laney had shot, one of Jed's hired cronies, had a shattered kneecap but would live. The circuit judge arrived 5 days after the shooting, a stern, hawk-nosed man from Cheyenne. The hearing was held in the saloon again, but this time Laney was not a defendant. She was a witness. She sat in the chair, Nathaniel's bandaged hand in her own. He had refused to stay in bed, insisting on being carried down, and now sat beside her, pale but resolute. Laney told her story. She started with her mother's death. She spoke of Jed's cruelty, the cold, the hunger. She told them, her voice clear and unwavering, about the night he'd tried to sell her, her words dropping like stones into the stunned silence of the room. She told them about running, about the snow, about Nathaniel finding her. When she finished, Silas Croft, who had come to watch, was no longer smirking. He was staring at his own counter, his face a pale, sickly gray. His wife, for the first time, looked ashamed. Jed Miller, his face blotchy with fear and rage, tried to lie. He called her a whore, a thief, a runaway, but his words were hollow, his eyes shifty. Then Mr. Rook, the bounty hunter, was called. He stood, his wrists in cuffs, his face impassive. The judge asked him if he had known the charges were false. Rook looked at Jed with cold contempt. "I was hired to retrieve property. Your Honor, I was given a warrant. I acted on that warrant." He paused, then looked at Laney. "But the warrant was for a girl, the woman who held a rifle on me, who shot my man, and who sat by Holt's side. That is not the same person." He shrugged. "The warrant's flawed. The girl it describes is gone." The judge was swift. Jed Miller was found guilty of filing a false report, of kidnapping, and of assault with intent to sell a person into bondage. He was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. Rook and his man, in light of the false warrant, were banished from the territory, warned never to return. The warrant for Laney's arrest was torn in two by the judge himself. He looked at her, his expression not unkind. You are free, miss, you are free to go." It took another 2 weeks before Nathaniel was strong enough to ride. The town had paid for their hotel room. People, shuffling their feet, had left baskets of food, fresh eggs, and smoked meat outside their door. Silas Croft himself had appeared, hat in hand, and offered them a full wagon of supplies, anything they needed, free of charge. Nathaniel, sitting up in bed, his side tightly bound, had looked at the merchant. "We'll take the flour, the coffee, the salt, and the ammunition," he said, his voice quiet. "And you will write me a bill. I pay my way." Silas had just nodded, his eyes on the floor. "Yes, Mr. Holt, whatever you say." When they finally rode out, the street was not empty. Martha was there, on the boardwalk. She waved, a broad, strong motion of her arm. Sheriff Brody was there. He tipped his hat. "Holt, ma'am." Laney, sitting straight on Bess, looked at the faces. Some still looked away, uncomfortable, unable to meet her gaze. Others, farmers and ranchers, gave Nathaniel small nods of respect. They did not look at her as trash. They looked at her as the woman who had shot a man in the saloon and stood by her own. She no longer flinched. She looked back at every one of them, her head high. She was not the girl who had stumbled out of the snow. She was Laney Holt. She turned her horse and followed her husband home. The valley was waiting for them, green and alive. The mud had dried. The creek was a clear, bubbling ribbon of water, and her small garden was pushing up stubborn green shoots. The cabin, after the small, dusty hotel room, felt like a palace. Nathaniel's recovery was slow. The wound, clean as it was, had taken his strength. He was frustrated, angry at his own weakness. He would try to lift a saddle or a sack of oats and his face would go white, the wound pulling, forcing him to stop. Laney became his hands. She fed the horses, mucked the lean-to, and tended her garden. She helped him walk. At first, it was just from the bed to the porch, his arm heavy over her shoulder, his feet shuffling. She was his crutch, his brace. "I'm a useless cripple," he growled one afternoon, slumping into the chair after a failed attempt to reach the barn. "You're a stubborn fool," she said, her voice sharp, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a damp cloth. "You took a bullet for me. Now, you will sit and you will heal. I am not losing you to impatience." He looked at her, at the fierce, protective fire in her eyes. He saw not a nurse, but a partner, a wife. He caught her hand and kissed her rough, soil-stained knuckles. "Yes, ma'am." Their bond, forged in ice and fire, now settled into the strength of rock. They had faced death and shame and the law, and they had won. There were no more shadows between them, no more unspoken fears. As his strength returned, they began to rebuild. The cabin was sturdy, but it was his. They would make it theirs. "That door," he said one morning, looking at the heavy plank door he had built years ago. "It's too dark." They felled a fresh pine, a tall, straight one. They spent 3 days in the sun, curing the wood, sanding it smooth with sandstone. It was Laney who took his knife. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Making it ours." She spent an afternoon, her tongue stuck out in concentration, carving into the soft, pale wood. She was not an artist, but her lines were deep and true. When she was done, she showed him. She had carved an N and an L, the letters leaning into each other, their stems tangled together like the roots of a tree. Nathaniel took the knife from her. Below the letters, he carved a single, simple circle, a ring, a promise. They hung the new door together, the bright, pale wood shining in the sun. Every time they passed through it, they were walking through their own vow. They expanded the fields. They cleared another acre, hauling stones, pulling stumps. He would work until his side ached, and she would work beside him, her small frame weird and strong. They planted potatoes, more corn, and beans. They were not just surviving, they were planning. They were building a larder for a future, for winters to come. Life settled into a rhythm, one Lainey had only dreamed of. She found a joy in the smallest things, a joy that was so profound it often brought her to tears. She would sing while she cooked. She had a low, sweet voice, a voice she had kept hidden, and the sound of it echoing in the cabin made Nathaniel stop his work just to listen. She would be kneading bread, her hands covered in flour, a folk song her mother had taught her humming from her lips, and he would come up behind her, wrap his arms around her waist, and just hold her, burying his face in her hair. She was no longer afraid of the horses. She brushed Bess and Amos every morning, her touch firm and confident. She would talk to them, telling them of her plans for the garden, and they would nicker softly, nudging her pockets for the bits of apples she saved. Nathaniel, on one of his supply runs, to Rawlins, never again to Bridger's Fork, came back with a heavy, cloth-wrapped parcel. "What's this?" she asked, her eyes wide. "You're always staring at my almanac," he said, gruff. "Figured you might want your own words." She unwrapped it. It was a book. Not an almanac, but a real book, bound in worn leather. It was poetry, and inside the cover, a small primer, a book for learning to read. I can't, Nat," she whispered, her face burning. "I don't know how. I never learned." "Then I'll teach you," he said. And he did. Every night by the firelight, his large, rough finger would trace the letters. Her head would be bent close to his, their shoulders touching. He taught her A and B and C. He taught her cat and house and love. He taught her to read her own name. The first time she read a full sentence from the poetry book, she wept, and he had kissed the tears from her cheeks. Their love was no longer a secret, hidden thing, born in the dark. It was as open and bright as the new door. They were husband and wife in all but name, and the valley was their witness. They would kiss on the porch, long, slow kisses in the morning sun, not caring who saw. They would dance. One night, a full moon lit the valley like a silver lantern. He was sitting on the steps, smoking his pipe. She came out and just stood there, watching him. "What is it?" he asked. "I've never danced," she said. He put his pipe down. He stood. He held out his hand. "Neither have I, not in a long time." He took her in his arms, and they moved, slow and awkward, on the rough planks of the porch. There was no music, just the sound of the crickets and the creek. He held her close, her head on his chest, his chin resting on her hair. They swayed, two quiet figures, dancing under the moon, and the laughter that bubbled up from Lainey's chest was as clear and pure as the night air. Their nights were a continuation of that dance. The raw, desperate need of their first encounters had gentled, deepened. It was no longer just a clash of bodies. It was a language. It was a slow, reverent touch. It was a tangling of limbs in the sheets, a shared breath in the dark. It was the absolute, profound safety of knowing the person beside you would die for you, and you for them. The spring was warm. The summer was bright. The fields grew. Lainey's thin frame filled out. Her hair was thick and shining. Her eyes, once haunted, were now clear and calm. One morning, late in the summer, she woke before him. The sun was just peeking over the ridge, painting the room in soft rose and gold. She felt strange, a rolling sickness in her stomach. She thought it was the rabbit stew from the night before. But it happened again the next morning, and the next. She was standing by the creek, her hand on her belly, when the truth of it, the simple biological fact, hit her. Her monthly courses were late, over 6 weeks late. She was pregnant. She sat on the creek bank, the world tilting, a child, a baby. Her hands went to her stomach, her touch trembling. A fierce, primal joy, so sharp it was painful, shot through her. A life she had made. With him, a new thing. a clean thing, born of love, not violence. And then the fear crashed over her. It was cold, just like the snow. She thought of her mother, coughing her life out. She thought of Sarah, Nathaniel's wife, screaming in a cabin just like this one, dying in fever. She thought of his child, the small, still boy he had never held. She was terrified, terrified of the pain, terrified of the blood, terrified of dying, terrified of failing him, of leaving him alone again, this time with a new grave to dig. She began to sob. She curled into a ball, her body shaking with the force of her joy and her terror, the two emotions inseparable. He found her there. He had woken to an empty bed and had come looking. He saw her, a small, weeping bundle by the water. "Lainey!" He ran, his heart seizing, thinking a snake, a wolf, thinking Rook had come back. "What is it? Are you hurt?" He knelt beside her, his hands frantic, checking her for wounds. I'm not hurt," she choked out, her face buried in her hands. "Then what? What is it?" She couldn't say it. She just took his large, calloused hand and pressed it flat against her stomach, against the place where the new life was. A secret, tiny spark. He froze. His rough palm was warm on her skin. He looked at her hand, then at her belly, then at her tear-streaked face. His own face went pale. He understood. "Lainey," he whispered, his voice full of a sudden, fragile awe. She nodded, a fresh wave of sobs shaking her. I'm scared. Nat, I'm so scared. Your wife, the baby, I don't want to die." Nathaniel's eyes filled. He looked at her, at this brave, strong, terrified woman who had rebuilt his life. He saw her fear, and he recognized it. It was the same fear he had lived with for 5 years, the fear of loss. He put his other hand on her stomach, his two hands cupping the small, almost flat plane of her abdomen, as if he could physically protect what was inside. He pulled her to her feet. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest, and he lifted her. He lifted her clear off the ground, holding her like she weighed nothing, his face buried in her neck. He was shaking. She could feel his body trembling. He was not crying. He was... She felt his lips move against her skin. He was laughing, a quiet, breathless, tear-filled laugh. "You're not Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick. "And this is not that time. You are strong. You are safe." He set her down, but he kept his arms locked around her, his forehead pressed to hers. He looked her deep in the eyes. "You're home now," he whispered. "We're home." A few weeks later, when the aspens on the high ridges were just beginning to turn gold, Lainey packed a small basket, some bread, cheese, and a flask of water. "Where are you going?" Nat asked, watching her from the doorway of the barn. "There's somewhere I have to go," she said, "before the snows come. A place I need to say goodbye." He knew. He did not ask. He just saddled Bess for her. "I'll come with you." "No," she said, her voice gentle. This one I have to do alone." He nodded, understanding. He lifted her into the saddle. "Be back by dark." She rode for 3 hours, back toward the world she had fled. She rode past the turnoff to Bridger's Fork, past the trail to the high pastures. She rode until she came to a broken-down fence line, to the land that had belonged to Jed. The shack was still there, but it was empty, dark, its door hanging open. She did not go to the shack. She went up the small hill behind it, to a bare patch of ground under a lone, wind-twisted cedar. Her mother's grave. It was marked by a pile of stones, just as she had left it. The weeds had grown high. Lainey dismounted. She stood over the grave for a long time. The wind was cold, carrying the first chill of autumn. She thought of the woman who lay beneath the dirt, a woman of faded beauty and broken dreams, a woman who had coughed her life away. "Mama," she whispered, She told her everything. She told her about the snow and the cold. She told her about Nathaniel. She told her about the cabin and the new door. She told her about the rifle and the saloon. She told her about the baby. "I'm safe, Mama," she said, her voice clear. "I'm finally safe." She reached into her pocket and took out a small pair of shears. She lifted a heavy lock of her own dark, healthy hair. She cut it, a long, thick piece. She knelt and tucked the lock of hair under the largest stone. A final offering, a piece of herself, left with the past. "Goodbye, Mama," she said. She was not crying. "Goodbye, Lainey." She stood. She was no longer Lana Miller, the girl who had been cast out. She was not the girl who had frozen. That girl was here, buried on this hill with her mother. She turned, got on her horse, and rode away without looking back. She rode toward the valley, toward the sinking sun. She rode toward the cabin, where she knew a fire would be lit. She rode toward the man who was waiting for her. He was standing on the porch, a dark silhouette against the warm, yellow light from the window. She dismounted and walked into his arms. Burying her face in his chest, he held her, his hand stroking her hair. "It's done," she said. "I know," he said. They stood there for a long time, watching the first stars appear. He took her hand. "Come inside," he said. "The air is getting cold." He led her from the porch. They walked, hand in hand, across the thawed, dark earth of the field, the garden she had planted, now harvested and resting. They walked toward the cabin, toward the warm light, toward the fire, toward the life they had forged, a life that had refused to die. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would be honored if you would comment and tell us where you are listening from. It means the world to us to know where our stories are traveling. Please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales like this one. And we would love to hear your thoughts on Lainey and Nathaniel's journey in English.